Plated Traditions channel. Welcome to the Plated Traditions channel with your host Kendra Moses. This is the Plated Traditions.
Hello and welcome to the Plated Traditions channel. My name is Kendra Moses, and as always, we have our brother, the Chef Kai, off camera. So when it comes to culinary arts and cooking in general, there's a lot of questions. There's usually a question always to be had when it comes to cooking. But I'm willing to wager, with all of those questions, the cloud of plethora of inquiry that's out there when it comes to cooking, I'm willing to wager they could be generalized into one core question. And that question is, does it really matter? And leaving the question at that, does it really matter? Short answer, yes, it does. Bye. Thank you again for joining us. For all of you who stayed around for that second, I do have a longer answer to that. So when it comes to cooking and the culinary arts, there are a lot of questions. It never fails. There is something new to be discovered. So when you have all these new discoveries and all these new bases of information coming at you, there's some things you'd be able to just say, oh, that's familiar, I could just tie it into this, and your level of understanding just seems immediate. And then there's some instances where you might come across something completely new and different, or something that may not seem as straightforward as the rest. And that's when questions start to come. And these questions start to come to everyone, whether or not there's someone that's just looking from outside the door sill of the kitchen, or someone who's in there in the kitchen starting off, or intermediate, professional, what have you. There's really no level of distinction when it comes to a point in time where the inquiries and the questions stop when it comes to the whole process of preparing a meal or a dish or food in general. There's a lot of them. There's so many questions, and there's something that always comes across. And these things happen for various reasons. And one of the biggest ones I'm always going on about, we are on a big earth. And a big earth that has all different types of resources, all different types of techniques that people are doing for cooking and preparing things, culturalize the way that things are done. And when you find yourself wanting to go down these different paths, there are some things that may be just familiar enough. They're just familiar enough for you to say, oh, I can easily tie it in with this bit of information I know. And it works because it is that adjacent. But there are some other things that come across that is really just a little bit too out the ordinary, or out the realm of the norm that you're used to. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's still a good idea to still go forward with it, but you might have to do the most obvious thing. You might have to ask a question, if nothing more, if you're just looking at the information in front of you and going, so what does that mean? And there's a process to this. You can ask yourself this question, and then you can either tell yourself, are you going to go forward with the recipe or the dish at hand, the instructions at hand? Or are you going to just say you're going to wing it, in which you most likely will lose the authenticity when it comes to whatever it is you were thinking about preparing? We then enter the realm of, as we referred to the other episode, where you lose that authenticity, you almost lose that ability to call the dish by the proper name that's listed on that recipe. Because if you have to defer too far away from the set of instructions with too many substitutions or too many changes in the way that the recipe dictated for this process to go. Holding the recipe card or the recipe notes or the recipe book, whatever form it's in, just holding it in your hand and looking at this dish's recipe and saying that, oh, it's still going to be this because I'm staring at this recipe, but I'm scarcely using any ingredient in it. I'm scarcely using any technique or any instruction. I'm not even sure, do I really want to use that temperature setting? Staring at the recipe is really not enough to say that you're authentically or sincerely recreating that item that you're looking at for instruction. So that's when it does really matter. In addition to that, especially if you somehow still expect that dish to taste like what's on that paper without doing the necessary steps that's on that paper. So that's when we come to a head about things, about does it really matter? And there are a lot of different factions, even on one recipe, about how many things in that recipe matter. And when I say a lot of different factions, I'm not just talking about it has 12 ingredients in it. If you have a full recipe, you will typically see at the very least the recipe's name, the recipe's ingredients, the recipe's instructions, the recipe's temperature setting, and the recipe's procedural techniques. And I know some of that may sound redundant, but it's really not. There are certain things that you have to do in certain dishes, especially when you're thinking about baking. Baking is a very particular method of cooking. When you're dealing with baking, you will have a very different and noticeable response or results when it comes to the end product. So when they tell you things like using a room temperature ingredient, or they tell you to have the oven preheated to 350, or when they're telling you to mix the sugar and butter together by themselves first using the creaming method. These particular instruction types do make a large difference in the type of result that you're looking for in your dish. Especially if you're going to this expecting a particular result, meaning this is a recipe that you know that has been prepared by somebody else, or maybe even prepared by yourself in the past, and you said, I really like this because of the way that the outcome came. But there's a certain thing that we end up doing, and the confidence can be a double-edged sword sometimes. You may have followed that recipe by the letter the first time because you were so nervous and so intent on getting that result that brought you so much jubilation when it came out. And from the appearance of the food to the taste, the texture, everything. But I will admit, even for myself, you do find yourself changing things sometimes. And sometimes this could be a necessity because you found out I did not have everything I thought I had. Or you might think that maybe I want to taste it with this flavoring instead. And you might have to use a different type of ingredient to make the flavoring. For example, you may end up saying you want this flavoring, but you only have this flavoring in a dry rendition. And the recipe called for a liquid rendition of a different flavoring. And does it really matter if they requested a tablespoon of a flavoring that's liquid and I'm using however much of a dry ingredient sans any extra liquid? Does that tablespoon of liquid make a difference? For some things, this could be negligible. For other things, you can find your end texture, especially like if it's a batter, seeming just that tad bit drier, a tad bit stiffer than it would have been if you used the liquid flavoring. And these are things that you will have to pay close attention to and notice. Either make notes physically or hold it in your mental Rolodex. But today, I keep mentioning recipe card, recipe books, because today I want to focus on the recipe itself. So the recipe is very synonymous, pretty much wherever you are in the world, to cooking. Not everyone goes by what we know to be a traditional recipe, like I explained a minute ago. For some people, a recipe could be just saying, we're making this, and you see me, we always have this meat, this vegetation, this type of stock or liquid, and this type of spice. And these individuals have just did that because everything probably just to taste. They know that these things will change, but the only things are the recipe just means to them, make sure you have these very specific set ingredients and use this technique, because we always use this technique. It's almost like a no-brainer. But for a lot of things, especially when we find ourselves sharing our different type of recipes, or we find ourselves going after different type of recipes from around the world, and that intrepidation about knowing whether or not you can do it, because you say you really want this, but it's not native to where you're from. But you love this dish. You love the rendition of this dish. Or you met somebody who made you this dish in an authentic manner. So you say you're going to chase up this lead. Yes, it's like you're a detective now. You're chasing up a lead, and you're saying you're going to get all this information from them. Now, as far as they're concerned, where they're from, like I said, as far as the recipe goes, it's really kind of non-existent. They just know that if you want this dish, you're going to have this type of heating source, because that's the typical heating source for this, the typical method of cooking for this. These are the typical ingredients. Season to taste, that's it. However, again, like I said, if you have any concern about messing up and not getting the authentic flavor, because you can't just keep these, you can't just keep them in your hip pocket for the next time you get hungry. You have to let this person go. So you have to find out a way that you're going to recreate this. And so that's where a recipe comes in. So when you're dealing with working with a recipe, or you're dealing with making a recipe from the verbal instructions that you receive, you, either case, whether it's already been pre-printed, whether it's been handwritten by a loved one, a friend, or you're writing down the instructions verbatim from a person that you want this dish from. Everything that's written, everything that is taught, it does matter. That end result to be the same, it does matter. And that's when it comes to you to pay close attention to each and every aspect of this, even down to the temperature, even down to possibly the method of cooking. And when I mention the method of cooking, I mean, if you have to boil something, it may not be necessary to boil it in a saucepan. You probably could boil it something that has a deep enough bottom or could hold enough water that covers the amount of food or heats up the liquid. If you're just heating up liquid, it may not matter if you're flavoring in stock. It may not matter if you're using a nice size pan that would typically be used for frying, but you're just cooking down liquid with the spices and everything in it. You may not need a saucepan for something like that. You could probably use something else that could hold that amount of liquid. However, if you have a different type, like if you have to use a clay pot for kind of like the baking process of it, where you have it on an open flame, you would need something that could suffice for something like that. You would need something that could be heat resistant enough to be, if it's directly over like an open flame, really heat resistant for higher temperatures. Depending on the flame, we're talking about temperatures that probably exceed your skillet's normal 400 Fahrenheit scale, possibly. So you need to make sure that if that's how it's done, it's a clay roasted thing, and that's also where the flavor is coming from. Not only that type of vessel to heat the food, which will change. These things can change how the food is cooked as well. You will see noticeable results if you cook it down something in a Dutch oven versus a regular aluminum pan. There will be, you can get the result of getting a finished or a done meal, but the process and possibly the texture, the outcome of it will be different. I want to say slightly, depending on your taste, it could be noticeable. It's still edible, still good, but it's still noticeable that this was done in a Dutch oven versus this being done in a thin aluminum pan. So yes, these things do matter. So when you're reading your recipe and you have specific instructions for also the equipment to be used, this is the time to figure out how much that means to you, because if that is also a part of that end result to give you that texture, that feel of the food, you will need to acquire this set of equipment and use the set of equipment. But if you said today is neither here or there, you just want that flavor close enough to it, you just want to feel like you had the taste in your mouth, you're not really concerned about things like texture, you can say, I'm gonna be alright substituting this out. And as we go along with this course and section, we will talk about all the different aspects of does it really matter. But today I just want to focus on really paying attention to your recipe. It doesn't have to seem like you being barred from creativity. That's not what the recipe is meant to do. The recipe is always there to inspire and instruct you. Those are the two main purposes of the recipe. If you want something and you want to be able to recreate it, you will need it. I don't want you all to just think about the recipe as being something so structured and organized. It may be better in a structured format as we see it in like a mass-produced book. However, the instruction itself, what's the content of the recipe itself, however it's written down, whether it's just written down freehanded by someone who's just a really good cook but not a book publisher, and that will happen because that's where most of the recipes end up coming from. Those are the people you really do end up wanting to recreate their dishes. You're not concerned about how they format the recipe, just how making sure that all the information that you need to recreate which you tasted from them and that you want to taste again whether or not they're with you or not. You just want to make sure that all that information is on there. And so I wanted to stress that a recipe, give it a chance still. Give it a chance on two fronts. Give it a chance for the fact that, do you really need to use the recipe? Does it really matter? Yes. If you want a particular outcome, yes, it will always matter. And then also give the recipe a chance, even though it may not be in a written or typed format. As long as you have all the information. It's a costly endeavor. It costs you your time, it costs you your money, and it costs any ingredients that you had intentions on using, if not for this dish, then for something else. And these ingredients can be possibly difficult to get. And that's just because of the budget, but because of the resources at hand. So there's a certain anxiousness that you do get by not wanting to mess up. And sometimes I think that the worst thing, but the most common thing that's done with this form of anxiousness is thinking that if you do it really quick and get it out the way, everything would just be good because you don't have time to think about it or this or that. Take the time to think about it sometimes. It shouldn't have to take you a whole day necessarily unless you're preparing yourself to getting certain specific ingredients, equipment, or whatever of that nature. Yes, that's feasible. That's a good reason and way to take your time. But if you're just looking at something, I advise you, if you feel the least bit ready, to just go. Just go for it. Let's go ahead and start the procedural process. It has to happen. Because if you're going to do it, period, it has to happen. It's not something you can put off. The longer you put it off, the longer you have an empty plate or something else on your plate besides the thing that you said that you wanted to try. But today, luckily enough, you don't necessarily have to take my word for all of this. We actually have a recipe here who's willing to discuss with you the importance of them being around. So, hey recipe, why is it that I said like I said, today it was just meant to really focus on the structure of a recipe, what to expect when you approach a recipe, what to expect, like as far as to see what's on it, and what to expect from the results of a recipe, the ramifications or the consequence probably of not following a recipe to the letter. And I just want to get you familiar enough with this because my goal and hope is that as we go through this section of Does It Really Matter and go to each and every aspect of a recipe and the procedures of cooking, that you all will feel comfortable enough to start not only tweaking and subbing out comfortably items in a recipe or techniques and styles and equipments in a recipe, but creating your own recipes yourself. I have confidence in all of you that you'll be able to do that.
Traditions music. Traditions music mix.
Hey recipe, why you got to want it like recipe? Why you got me using all of this recipe? The shortest gonna come out this recipe. I'm not sure, I got a win. Because I said so. Are you forgetting it? I know I didn't know. If you ask me one more question, you know we might come to the close. I don't know what you listen at my thought. Du har mig så kort i vart forkert du har din dog. If you want that dish, you come out just before. Resisting to your body wants you to crack it go. It's just one thing you need to know. I said so. I said I'm not being unfair. I don't mind you looking take the stare. Just be well aware. And for quality, take care. I'm not leading you astray or try to mess up your day. But if you want to fool, this is the right way. You better do what I say. You gotta give, put your trust in me.
Thank you again for joining us for another week. We hope to see you again next time. Bye bye.